All right. So we'll be recording this session so we can share it out on our website. And welcome back, everyone. Again, my name is Clara Buie. I am the Associate Director for the Office of Multicultural Affairs. And this week, I am joined by a dear friend and colleague, Tarah Cicero, from Community Conversations About Race, which is the CCAR program. What we wanted to do today is give the opportunity to follow up on our previous conversations on how to have difficult conversations with your family. And we thought it would be a good idea, especially after this past holiday, to circle back, follow up, talk to you all, see how things went, go over a couple of the tips that was shared last session, and perhaps even add a couple more and maybe even expand a little bit on that. So Jennifer Swan will not be with us today. However, she is definitely in spirit. As you can tell by the picture on the screen, this was her plate this Thanksgiving. And so she had some fun with that and wanted to share that with you all. And as I said, she's with us in spirit and really excited about having this follow-up conversation today. So Tarah, do you want to give a brief introduction of who you are and then we can get going?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Clara. So hi, everybody. I'm Tarah Cicero. I work in human resources at Lehigh and a proud member of the CCAR team, and excited to be back and co-hosting with Clara. This is the first time we've done this together, so I'm very excited about that. And also to share Jennifer's mashed potato sculpture from her holiday. So one thing that Jennifer let Clara and I know about was that at her Thanksgiving, they had a mashed potato snowman making contest, which was one of the recommendations the group came up with. Like, yeah, sit at the kids' table, make a mashed potato snowman. And she said they had the contest, this was hers, and the youngest participant was 25. So good reminder that you don't have to be a kid to do these things. So, but thank you, Clara, and the OMA team for, having this follow-up conversation. Thanks to all of you for being here today.
Absolutely. Now, Tarah, do you know if she won the contest? Because that's a pretty good snowman.
I don't. We should ask her though. We'll have to ask her next time. It is really good. Yeah, the nose.
Yeah. Looks
Better
great.
greens. Looks good. So yeah, so how many of you were here with us for the holiday, surviving the holidays part 1 conversation? Were any of you here with us? Okay, so we talked about a few different tactics for getting through the holiday as easily as possible. We talked a lot about the importance of listening and how, we may hear things that we don't agree with, and how, we should listen as best we can, right? Like be very focused and active as listeners. And then we talked a lot about curiosity, about asking folks questions to kind of understand, where are they coming from? How did they get to this place where maybe they have this point of view that we don't agree with? And even the idea of walking away if we need to, if it's becoming a damage sort of situation. And another thing we talked about that Jennifer told us at the end was a brain hack. Jennifer is a neuroscientist, and she shared research with us where if you hold a warm beverage while you're speaking with someone, your chances of having a warmer perception of them increase. So I definitely used that one at one point. I'll share that. But so did any of you over the holidays, like how were your holidays? And did you try any of that stuff that we talked about? Listening, asking questions, walking away if we needed to, or even holding the warm beverage. Did anyone give that a shot?
I tried the warm beverage one, and it just made me laugh because as I was doing it, I knew why I was doing it. So it was just really funny. But then I also thought, like, I actually enjoy my cold beverage more. So I was very torn, but at the same time, then I'm having that discussion in my head and I'm ignoring the problem in front of me. So maybe it's for the best.
So it was a distraction for you then, Renee. Yeah. Excellent. Any others? How were your holidays, and any use of any of the tips that were shared?
I know for me, Clara, I thought about our group and the conversation we had going into Thanksgiving, because for me, something came up and it was like one of those, it wasn't a charged conversation per se, but it was something where something that happened to me when I was younger, that's not a joke to me, is a joke to somebody else. And that came up and I found myself in a place where, you know, I had to figure out what to do with that. Right. And it was fortunate that the conversation about that didn't last too long and we were able to like quickly change the subject. My partner thankfully intervened and just kind of, it wasn't like, oh, so how's the weather sort of thing, but not far from it. So that was one thing that I experienced. I thought of our group during that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this, Tara. Especially because sometimes when we think about conflict and we think about, it's sometimes that back and forth, but it could just be a comment that somebody makes, and that is what's sitting with us for the longest time. And so, it takes different forms. So I appreciate you sharing that example.
Thanks, Clara.
Yeah. Any others? You don't have to go into specific details or anything like that, but just wondering if anyone wants to share some of their holiday experiences.
I wasn't here for the last meeting, but I've been here for other similar conversations. So I feel like I probably have at least somewhat of an understanding of what you discussed. But I have an example for something that I wasn't in the room for this, but I heard like the explosion from another room. And just one person made a joke that someone else didn't think was particularly funny. And I think it was a misogynistic joke, essentially. And someone else kind of exploded at them just instantly. And I was thinking that it might have been a much more productive conversation if the person who reacted very strongly, just maybe asked the person who made the joke a few questions, like, like why do you think that's funny? Or like, why do you think that's, that they might have been more, the person who made the joke might have been more open to thinking about why that joke isn't an okay joke to make if the person just didn't attack them instantly.
Yeah, that's such a good point to bring up, Erin. And it's interesting too when we're kind of like on the outside looking in and thinking, well, hopefully, if this strategy was implemented, perhaps this would have worked this way. And oftentimes, even when it comes to our own reactions, we forget what is the next tactic I should take, or where is the strategy I should take. So it's also, it's not great to see those explosions happen, but it's also a way for us to kind of think about what ways would we then proceed in a situation like this, right? Thanks for sharing.
If I could jump in here,
Sure.
I think that I don't think you always have the time or the luxury to stop and think about a response.
Right.
I think that frequently when we kind of explode, this last transaction is just sort of, the last straw. You're probably reacting to 4 other jokes that you bit your tongue with. And finally, somebody has to bear the brunt of it. And you unload. Not the worst thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Just to follow up on that, I just think what is particularly challenging about these discussions in this context is I think that families have like patterns of interacting with each other, and sometimes they are good patterns and sometimes they are kind of maladaptive patterns that don't function so well. And it can be just extremely difficult to break out of those patterns, especially if only one person is trying to establish a different pattern and the other person is still maybe engaging in behaviors or that are driven by emotional reactions that aren't particularly productive. It's just, yeah, it's such a challenge.
It sure is, Erin. And I'm so glad that you brought that point, because some of the things that we're going to talk about today speak to that, as to how, those, not just those patterns, and behaviors, but also the people that we're interacting with, and what it is that we can actually do to change, or perhaps it's out of our reach to change. And so recognizing how that works. So Tara, we can go into the next slide. And folks, as we continue on, please jump in. Don't feel as if we need to, talk at you. This is definitely a conversation as we've been working through these community M rooms. It's a discussion, not a lecture, right? So feel free to unmute yourself and jump in whenever you'd like.
So one of the things that Clara and I thought we could talk to you all about today, maybe something you've heard about before, is the circle of influence. Has anyone heard about that? Circle of influence versus circle of concern. So for those of you who are new to this idea, it comes from, I think it's from Covey, and it's about being proactive and versus being reactive, right? So when you have let's look at on the left-hand side here, your circle of influence is the stuff that you have control over, right? Your circle of concern is stuff that you're worried about. So I'm worried about COVID-19, right? I can't control the spread of COVID throughout the world, but what can I control? I can control how frequently I'm washing my hands. I can control whether or not I'm vaccinated. I can control what places I go to, how many people I'm around, things like that. So, and that could be applied to a lot of different circumstances. It could be applied to problems we encounter within our families, or even at work, let's say. So people who are proactive tend to focus their efforts on the circle of influence. They tend to focus on stuff that they can control or do something about. And people who are more reactive are focused on the circle of concern, the stuff that you don't really have much control over. So as we approach these conversations with folks, during the holidays, how much can we can't control their behaviors, right? But what we can control is how we react to those behaviors.
Mm-hmm. I love that concept. And as we were talking about the circle of influence, it reminded me of some other concepts that we utilize, particularly when we do anti-racism workshops and the work that we do in that area. And something that we focus in on are the spheres of influence. So there's circle of influence and there's spheres of influence. Now, the spheres of influence are the people that were actually part of our circles, whether there's the smaller circle that includes ourselves or our family, friends. Then there's the outer circles that continue on with perhaps colleagues, peers, work friends or coworkers. And then outside of that, a little larger, is the community, right? Those outside of those smaller circles that we are so connected to. And so when we think about the difference between circle of influence and sphere of influence, in my opinion, there's a lot of connection there, right? The way in which we are able to influence others or even ourselves really relates to what is it that we can actually change? What are those things that actually are able to be changed by our actions, right? Whereas a circle of concern is something that I am very deeply concerned about, but I don't necessarily have the power to necessarily make the change on a larger scale. And so I look to my spheres of influence to be able to influence that circle of influence of things that I can manage and change. And so I like that understanding of those different terms to put into perspective, what are some of those areas that we can actually make a difference for ourselves or for others. So what do y'all think about these terms? Questions, thoughts, anything that kind of came to mind as Tara and I shared these pieces, these concepts?
I think the thing that came to my mind was how fluid this idea of the focus on, let's say, the circle of influence or the circle of concern can be based on the context that you're in. So let's say you're with some family members, you may have more visceral reactions to the things that they say and the things that they do, and focus more on, oh my God, I don't know what this person is going to say. I don't know what this person is going to do, because you recognize you have so little control over that. And so there's perhaps greater focus on what they may say, like I said, what they may do, and then you become more reactive, right? Instead of making peace with the fact that, yeah, Clara is X, or, Tarah is Y, and that's what it is. But you haven't gotten to a point where you're able to kind of accept that. So it becomes more difficult to do. But then in terms of being in another space where you don't have to worry about those things, then it doesn't become an issue. So for example, I was with some family last week, and let's say that they're, woke, so we're having all these academic discussions and, and so on. So we're not in a space where we're feeling like anybody's saying anything that's inappropriate or anything like that. But then we have a bigger family gathering on Saturday, and my grandmother then asked my cousin at the end, she's like, well, so when am I going to be able to attend your wedding? And we're like, okay, then. But, we kind of laugh it off, and, we have a discussion subsequent to that, because we're like, yeah, there's nothing we can do about her asking that question. And it was not to kind of then internalize how that makes you feel. But then we started having a discussion about, why is it that no matter what, women are judged about the decisions that they make and the choices that they make, and why they're not at this particular point in their life. So then the circle of influence in that respect made us more proactive, because we're just having these engaged discussions, understanding that, yeah, there are some things that we definitely can't control, and we're not even going to internalize it. So I think in a lot of ways it's so fluid, and it just depends on where you are and with whom.
Absolutely. And I love how you pose that, Acadia, because it really does depend on the context, right? And the folks that you are working with, and what it is that we're trying to get at. Some of those pieces are certainly part of that circle of concern where we really can't necessarily make a difference. And some are a part of the influence. And it also depends on the individual and the power that they hold, right? So if you hold more power, there is a larger chance that that circle of influence is a lot larger than someone who perhaps doesn't have the power to make those changes. Any other thoughts?
Right. Do you think, Clara, we should take a look at some of the learner versus judger?
Oh,
stuff that we were
absolutely. Yeah,
talking about?
let's go into that. Sure.
All right. Yeah, so I've been full disclosure, I really got into that show, Ted Lasso, that came out pretty recently, right? And I ended up printing out something and hanging it in my office that says "Be curious, not judgmental," because I won't ruin the show. It's solid. It's a good show. But as we're interacting with folks, one of the ways that we could help kind of navigate our way through these conversations is thinking about the types of questions we're asking, right? As we, engage in either conflicts or these difficult conversations. So, thinking about, are we being judgmental with our questions, or are we being more of a learner and being curious and trying to figure out, what's going on here? And that aligns with what Jennifer shared with us 2 weeks ago, the last time we were talking about this topic. Like, ask folks questions to better understand. And this also could help us as individuals kind of make sense of the behaviors, right? So on the right-hand side, you have learner questions, and those are more open-minded, curious, creative. Those types of questions will promote progress, possibilities, and usually those types of questions can lead to discovery, understanding, and coming to solutions, right? Judger questions can do the opposite. It's more closed-minded, certain critical kind of stuff. And those are focusing more so on problems versus solutions. And asking those questions could kind of lead to defensive reactions, right? It could lead to negativity and the types of things we don't want to have when we're interacting with our families. So I think really those learner questions could help facilitate our progress by expanding the options that we have versus limiting progress by asking the judger questions. I know in my own world and some of the interactions I have, I try to think about that. It's not easy. As Jennifer shared with us a couple weeks ago, this stuff takes a lot of practice, and all of us can naturally fall back into the judger category, right? But I'm curious, like, has anyone found themselves trying to flip their thinking from the judger to the learner and had success with that? I think too with this, oops, just lost the slideshow. Enjoy this beautiful photo of the English countryside that my friend took. There we go.
We can still see it.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Yep. Mhm.
I think I'm sharing, I was sharing Chrome, not my screen. Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so I think it's just, reminding ourselves too, like, we're recovering judgers. That's one of the phrases we use when we talk about conflict, like in some of the workshops I teach. And, just thinking about, we're going to ask those questions, and at any given moment in these interactions, we have the power to kind of shift our thinking and be more curious and less judgmental. It's not easy, but with practice, it gets a little bit easier, and that could help change some of the results too. So, yeah, any thoughts or questions? I'll pause there.
I loved looking at the questions that were in the previous slide. Just thinking about how we phrase or how we frame our questions, and how much of a difference it makes for those who are receiving those questions, right? I would rather you ask me what's working or how are things going in a way that is much more positive than what's going on, what's wrong, right? There's a very different tone in the way that you pose a question like that. And I think that tone really speaks to whether or not you're going to get a defensive response or not, right? Or you're going to get a response that's much more coming from a place of helping you feel that curiosity and have that curiosity in that response as well, so that there is this reciprocal conversation happening.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Clara.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on that?
I feel like the learner question is going to really highlight that these discussions are kind of going to be incremental in order for them to be successful, that you're just not going to like jump in and fix someone's opinion, or you shouldn't. That's really not going to be productive. I think like the learner questions just highlight that it's a process. It's not just something that's going to happen instantaneously. I think, at least for me, that is something that is difficult for me, because sometimes people say things that I perceive as like harmful. And so I want to stop that harm. And I probably end up using questions or strategies that fall more in that judger category. But if I were to utilize maybe the learner strategies, then I could also stop the harm and engage in a more effective strategy that might help someone not do that again in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the question that's also put on the chat. What do you do when the person doesn't want to engage, or when their opinions are repugnant, right? And so I really like those questions, because we're often thinking about what are others going to say, what are others going to think, what are their responses going to be. But if we look back or think about the circle of concern and the circle of influence, right? Those are more concern in the sense of we really can't control what somebody else is going to, how they're going to respond, or how they're going to, whether or not they're going to accept the question or continue the conversation in a way that is going to come to a place of understanding for the both of us. What we can do with that circle of influence is pose the questions or ask the questions in a way that kind of help us get there. And so it could be a toxic response to a question or something that really is harmful for us. And perhaps what we can do is ask, well, why do you feel that way? What are some reasons why you're responding? And trying to get to the core as to where they're coming from. But at the end of the day, if it continues that way, then, go back to that circle of concern. Hey, you know what? Perhaps this isn't the time. Perhaps this isn't the question. Perhaps this isn't the mode in which we should be having this conversation. And just thinking about some of the tips that were shared is maybe that's the time for us to say it's okay to disagree here. You have your opinion, I have mine, and move on. And that's easier said than done. However, that is something that I think at a point where the conversation is not going anywhere, that we need to reflect on how do we then bow out and kind of move forward and move on. Any other thoughts on that? Tara, I know that you wanted to maybe perhaps jump in on here.
Thanks, Clara. I really appreciated that. And I'm also thinking about how, like, we're asking the learner question, thinking about asking the learner questions of others and also asking them of ourselves, or just so we could cope with some of these conversations. Like when, like others, I've been engaged with folks, who have these opinions where I'm like, where the heck did that come from? Maybe that's the question I'm asking myself, like, okay, how did this person get there? Even if it's not a point where engaging is appropriate, or maybe it's not the right time for another reason. Just kind of, I find in my own experience, sometimes asking myself that will help me cope with it, at least until that issue, if we can address it later, can be addressed. Or at least if I can understand the behavior, for me, it makes it a little easier to deal with, even though I can't make sense of it from how I interact with the world. So just want to throw that in there as well.
Absolutely. I like that framing too, of asking ourselves those questions, right? It's not always about asking the other folks, but also reflecting back on our own thoughts and our own ideas.
Any other thoughts from the group? So with that kind of naturally leads into some of some questions that you could ask yourself, right? As far as the idea of any sort of conflicts that folks could be engaged in around the holidays, be it with family or whomever, but just kind of taking that minute to pause and reflect. If you see that the conflict is escalating, maybe the conversation moves to, if any of you have gone through crucial conversations training, which is one of the workshops we have here at Lehigh for staff and faculty, we talk about like moving towards silence, which is where you just totally, in an unhealthy way, disengage. We've been talking a lot today about the importance of it is okay to walk away when it gets to a point where there's bad damage or harm taking place. But by silence here, it's more so not addressing the conflict just because we don't want to address it, not because we're not wanting to put in that effort, right? So there's the silent side, and then the violence could be, angry language, not necessarily, not physical, but more so the violence of language, saying things are very mean and hurtful. But so if you find that you're engaged in a conflict and it's escalating to that point, it's taking that moment to pause and reflect, trying to ask some of the learner questions. And on this slide, which we'll share the link in the chat to the presentation from today, just some of those questions you could ask yourself, like, what do you think the other person might be thinking or feeling or wanting? Is there something I'm missing as I engage with this person? Am I making any assumptions? What am I responsible for here in this conflict? And again, just taking that moment to pause and reflect on what we're contributing could also help us get a little closer to a more healthy interaction, if you will. Yeah.
I love the question, how else can I think about this? Oftentimes we have this one way of thinking of certain certain things, and being able to ask ourselves, wait a minute, is there's another side? Maybe I can try that on and figure out how it's affecting me, and how perhaps I can think about it differently, in a way that will help get to that understanding, right?
Yeah.
Or perhaps not, and maybe it doesn't get to an understanding, but at least asking ourselves that question is important.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Clara.
Mhm.
I'm-
Yep,
Oh,
go ahead.
No, it's
Go
okay. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
No, I was just also thinking about, what am I missing or avoiding? That's another
Yeah.
great one, right? Because again, we don't always have all of the information going into a conversation. We don't always have all of the pieces to that puzzle. And so asking ourselves and reflecting, what's missing here? What is something that perhaps I don't want to talk about, or I'm trying to avoid? And how does that affect the conversation itself?
Yeah. And one that stands out to me is that, what do I want, right? Because we're engaged with folks who are not agreeing with about something. And if it's around a holiday, they likely could be family or people who we're close to who aren't blood relation or relation through marriage or whatever else. So that's like, what do I want? It's like, all right, at the end of the day, I want to be able to interact with this person well. And, I love this person. I want to continue for us to be in a relationship of some sort, be it family or otherwise. So it's just like pausing and asking that one. It's like, I'm coming here with love, from love, then maybe that's the reminder that I need to get past it on my own. Yeah. Okay.
Anyone else? Any of these questions stand out to you, or maybe you've used some of them? And what are your thoughts on this?
I just had just a statement rather. I read a book recently called Think Again by Adam Grant, and I missed the beginning of this presentation, so I'm not sure if he talked about it, but he talks about 3 different identities when we're engaging with people, and particularly if you have different stances, and that is of preacher, prosecutor, and politician. And that preacher being that we're right, we want to stick to our ideas, and prosecutor, we're really, you're pointing out the flaws in the other person's ideas, or and the politician, where we're really judgy about the things. So one of the questions I always ask when I get into a conversation or dialogue when there's a difficult conversation to be had is really just pausing and reflecting and saying, tell me more.
Yes.
That way it gives us both a chance to have our ideas expressed, and both of us a chance to reflect on the other's ideas. Just tell me more. It's a real simple question, but it's kind of falls in line with all these questions that are up on the board right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love that. Tell me more. And it's not defensive. It's not in a way of like judging. It's really going towards what we had discussed earlier, that learner model, right? Asking the question, I'm curious where you're coming from with this particular thought. And I think that lends itself to a much more constructive conversation, rather than, that prosecutor or that, preacher model of like, that assumption that I'm right. And so you need to jump on this wagon with me, rather than, understanding where the person is coming from. Much different. And I love that piece, those tips, those points that you just made, and in somewhat relates to a little bit of what we were talking about as far as the learner and judge model, right? There's that judger or learner, so it's somewhat it works together. But really appreciate those pieces that you shared, Holly. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Holly. I jotted down the name of that book, and I look forward to checking it out. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts about these questions? Anything else standing out? Anything that someone wants to try? Well, in exploring our difficult conversations for the holidays, all the knowledge and information that's out there, we came across an article with a pretty nice graphic that we thought we'd share with you all today. And while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to put the link right here in the chat to get into the presentation. But yeah, so this article from Very Well goes through a lot of different techniques and tactics for how to engage during the holiday season, these difficult conversations. And we have it, in the resource list, and there's a link at the bottom here. But here it shares like setting those conversation boundaries. It's absolutely okay to say, you know what, now's not the time to discuss this, and leave it at that. I'm thinking again, my own experience in the more recent holiday, that's something I wish I had done on my own. Thankfully, someone was there to do that for me, right? And maybe that's a part of it too. Like if we notice that happening, can we be that person for somebody else? Yeah.
And I think that that's such an important point, Tara. Oftentimes, I know that I think back to the guidelines for effective dialogue, for example, as a guide for myself, right? But I know that not everyone is familiar with or utilizes those guidelines. And so, oftentimes those guidelines they are such a fantastic tool for conversations and workshops and sessions and in groups and with people that we don't know. However, we don't often put guidelines in place or put these boundaries in place when we're having conversations with loved ones, with folks that we're sharing a meal with in our home or in someone else's home. It's difficult to say, oh, well, let's talk about these guidelines before we even get into any type of family conversation tonight, right? So it's finding a way to set those boundaries without sounding like you are, holding a workshop or a session in your home and at your table. So that's something that I kind of think about is how do I translate some of the things that I've utilized and skills and tools that I've gained with having these conversations. How did I translate that from work to home or work to family, right? And so I really like the way that it's set here, set conversation boundaries. There has to be a way for us to be able to do that is natural in the setting that we're in and in the context that we're in.
Yeah, I'm wondering, could it look like, let's say you're getting together with family members, you know that you disagree. Politics is a very easy one, I think, to use, but we know we disagree politically. We haven't been able to spend a holiday together for 2 years. Maybe we focus our conversations on something else, and politics come up. Can we all agree that we don't want to talk about that during the holiday? Now, does that work? Who knows? Once people have a couple cocktails or whatever happens, but yeah, I like that, Clara. It's something interesting to consider. How do you naturally pull what we learned from visions into life outside of Lehigh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've shared the story that I often utilize those guidelines with my own children, right? So they speak that language, but I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, they're not at Lehigh, they're not at work, right? But it's still a useful tool. And again, it's just a matter of how you introduce it. And you don't have to use the same exact language, but the concept of it, the idea of it, and how does that translate into the environment and the situation that you're in. So the next one is prepare de-escalation tactics. So important, right? And the situation that you're coming into as far as whether or not that it may evolve into something that would need to be just de-escalated. And so what would be some strategies that you can put that plan in place before it even occurs, right? And understanding what is my game plan here? Is there an escape route, or is there a different topic that I can kind of switch to? How do I de-escalate a situation that will turn into something a lot more toxic? And that's so important to think about before it even happens, so that we are prepared and it avoids those kind of situations where we're just stay silent and then wish we would have said what we would have said the thing, right? Or done the thing. So again, it just gives us that opportunity to prepare ourselves before going into conversations. If anyone has anything to add to that or any of the two that we just talked about.
Well, the third one that's listed here is focusing on fun family traditions. So I know in my family, I'm Italian and English, different sides. And the Italian side, Christmas Eve is this huge thing where it's like all about the 7 fishes, which I don't eat any sort of meat, but they focus the 7 fishes and opening gifts. Like Christmas Eve is more so the important thing. So I'm thinking with this one, what's coming to mind in my own family is, okay, could we, as if the conversations get a little heavy, is it saying like, oh, is it time to open the gifts? I'm not sure how that translates. I'll have to prepare a de-escalation tactic related to that, but that's kind of what came to mind for me with this. Like, what traditions does your family have that can be the focus, so maybe the conversation doesn't go in a bad direction?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
like that. Something that I'm not really into is football. However, a lot of my family members are, and that, is somewhat of a tradition, I guess, while the meal is being prepared or, things are going on, there's a game happening, right? And so, sometimes that takes us away from concentrating on those heavier topics, and maybe maybe if you're sports inclined, which I am not, but you could talk about the game, you could talk about the score, so there may be other topics that could come up that if there are specific traditions that could be put into place rather than leaving the door open for those controversial topics. And hey, some folks want to dive in, right? And we talked about that the last time we were together. Some folks welcome the conflict and want to be able to open up and have the opportunity to talk about things. So again, it's a matter of your own individual way of being able to understand that maybe this is going to happen. And so should I then fall into that and continue that conversation, or do I find strategies to de-escalate and perhaps avoid those conversations? So those are questions that we need to ask ourselves before we get into the actual conversation or the environment that may lead to that.
I appreciate you bringing that in, Clara, the reminder that everybody's family is different, right? And in some instances, the conflicts, the debate is welcomed. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then the last one here is the alternative topics. So is it coming in thinking about things that are a little, again, if your family is not one to debate healthily and you just want to be able to shift it, what alternative topics that are a little safer could be brought up?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What could that look like? It could look like, maybe fun trips down memory lane, as long as they're memories that are happy for everyone in the room, right? Or be, focusing on gratitude. That could be something too. That's usually pretty healthy. Like, what are we? Oh, so grateful to be here together. Again, looks different depending on how your family interacts, but just thinking about some of those alternative topics beforehand could, again, as Clara spoke to earlier, help you be better prepared if something unfolds. So any thoughts, questions? Is there anything any of you have tried that's listed here that you could share with the group to kind of help us prepare for our holidays?
I think focusing on younger children sometimes is a great distraction. I come from a family in which the younger children are musical or theatrical or whatever, and that is a quick, easy diversion. Oh, grandpa, look what your granddaughter's doing, and that always works. And the other thing that was tremendously helpful this year to me is I overfed everybody, and 2 or 3 of my guests fell into a deep sleep on the couch immediately after the meal. That really, really helped the day go a lot smoother for me. So.
Oh my goodness, Susan, I am cracking up because that happened in my house as well. And my brother just fell asleep on the couch, and it's just maybe overfeeding is the way to go. But I really, really like that.
Oh,
But the focus on the children is really great too. Sometimes we, overlook that they are also looking for attention. Maybe they don't see all of the family members together. And so it is a nice opportunity to be able to bring in the younger generation and maybe showcase some of their talents, or even just bringing them into a specific conversation that takes us away from those harder conversations that might be going on.
I love that recommendation.
Absolutely.
If you're in a family that doesn't have young children, I'm thinking like my mother's house, there were 5 dogs there on Thanksgiving. So easy to shift to that topic because there are just dogs literally everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's always easy to ask about like a recipe, there's always food all around. So asking someone about something that they made. And there's also always a lot of activities. So maybe if you're observing something going wrong, you can make someone go do something, like go put that table away, or go get this from the garage, that kind of thing.
Oh, I like that.
Distraction. I like that. Mhm.
Send them to go get ice. That's always like the one thing that's missing. Then they have to actually leave the house.
Those intentional distractions. That's lovely. I love that. So think about what are some things that we can have folks do
Yeah.
if things start going in a different direction. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Those are great recommendations.
I'll remember that if I'm ever at your house, Claire, and you tell me to go get ice.
Or you might be like my brother who fell asleep on the couch tonight. So who knows? It's fantastic. Well, we do have just a short time left together. And before we end, we did find this very short video, which I think gets right to the point as to some tips that could be useful when you are in those situations. So we'll play this and then come back and talk a little bit about it, and end with some final tips for the group so that we can move forward with our holiday celebrations. All right.
I'm Matt from Dadwell with 3 tips for surviving the holidays with your family. Tip number 1, always have an escape plan. The holidays are stressful, and visiting family can reopen old wounds and ignite conflict that will wreak havoc on your mental health. So when things are getting tense, take a break, go for a walk, call a supportive friend, plan a way to get away when you need to. Tip number 2, ask for support. In most families, the lion's share of the responsibilities on any given holiday are going to fall on one or maybe a few people. If you are one of those people in your family, it is okay to ask for support. And tip number 3, identify an advocate. For many of us, home is not a place where we feel entirely welcome or invited to be fully ourselves. That's why it's so important to have someone in our corner who understands us, who supports us, and who can bring relief in those stressful, intense situations.
Happy holidays!
What are some thoughts on those tips? Or I think it really nicely wraps up some of the things that we talked about today. I really like the first one of stepping away. I mean, I know that that's not always possible, especially if you're hosting, but being able to say, you know what, I just need a breather. I need to go to a different space to kind of, gather myself. I feel that that could be useful. And it could be, I'm going to go check on the kids. Maybe the kids are in a certain room and they're playing, and that kind of takes your mind off of what's happening in another space. So really like that. And also one that I haven't really thought about was identifying an advocate. And I think that happens somewhat naturally when you have a certain dynamic with folks that are in the room, but that's not always as obvious. So really being conscious of who our advocates are and leaning on them for support, I think is something that I personally will be taking into account and utilizing.
I like the idea too. if you know you're going into a situation, it's likely going to be difficult, which is the case for several folks, right? Like, is there that friend who you could say, hey, I'm going to my family's today from X time to X time. Will you be around if I need someone to talk to? And kind of setting that up ahead of time.
Mhm. Absolutely.
That was definitely a new one. Are
Any-
there?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Any of these stick out for you, or anything else that you wanted to add to those tips? I don't know if you had a different question, Tara.
Nope. Same one.
All right. Well, we don't necessarily want to prolong things. However, this was a very, I think, hopefully valuable conversation for everyone. We will be putting the presentation, actually the link is in the chat, but it's also going to be with the recording. And we have some great resources available. And I'm going to let Tara talk a little bit about the LinkedIn Learning, but these resources that we have in the next slides are also really useful for you to look through and perhaps get some tips that are going to work for you as individuals. I mean, some of the things that we shared in the previous conversation and in this one may not work for everyone. However, you know, being able to have as many options, I think, are what's really going to help us as individuals figure out what works for us. So Tara, did you want to just really briefly talk about the LinkedIn Learnings? I think that one was really useful for folks to know that is available for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who are with us today, who are part of the Lehigh community, be you staff, faculty, student, all of us have access to LinkedIn Learning, and there's a lot out there, thousands of courses. And we've included a link on how to activate your LinkedIn Learning account, and also two different courses that could be helpful for difficult conversations with family or others, right? So just wanted to make sure that we shared those out with folks. And then after that, Elizabeth Miller was with us during the 11/18/21 session. So Surviving the Holidays Part 1. And she put a bunch of resources in the chat. So Clara and I included those in today's presentation as well. Again, so you had those as a resource should you want to check those out. We also have some stuff from Braver Angels, which is a group that Jennifer Swan is getting involved with, and I'm starting to as well, where their goal is really to help people better interact across. Oh, sure thing, Tyler. I'll open that up. Interact across political lines. So they actually have a session coming up. Jennifer had asked that we share this with you on December 11th, helping loved ones divided by politics. So there's more information there. So you can check that out as well if you're interested, and sign up via their sign up platform. So I think, is there anything I'm missing, Clara? Anything else? I know I kind of went through that quick.
Yeah, I think that's all we have. However, these types of conversations, we invite CCAR to come in and help facilitate these conversations. So if there's more of these that you'd like to see or hear, please let us know. It's always great to partner with CCAR and be able to have these types of conversations that are sometimes a little difficult to have on our own. So thank you and appreciate you, Tara, so much. Appreciate Jennifer Swan as well for being here in spirit and sharing some of the resources as well. And as always, really appreciate all of you for being with us. We have a couple more of these happening this semester, and then we're going to take a break and come back in January to be able to, continue all on these topics. So we'll have our session next week, and the last one will be on the 16th. So see you back here Thursdays at noon. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Clara. Thank you, Renee. And thanks to all of you. Take care. Happy holidays. All right.
Excellent. Thank